Africanity episode of this Thursday, March 20th, 2025. Yesterday was the 5th anniversary of my dad's death. My dad, Victor Fotso. If you don't know who he is, I did a podcast basically telling his story, which is an amazing story. But on this Thursday, me and Tay, I wanted to talk about Africanness, Africanity. Does it exist? Is there such a thing as an African identity? For a long time, and a part of me still believe that I don't think that Africanness, I don't think that Africanity exists. I think that it's in the eyes of the other. Always. I think that you become very much aware that there's an Africanness, that there's an Africanity when you're an African, when you're born in Cameroon and go to live in another country, to live in the US, as has been my case. So when you get to the US, you become aware that not only are you black, and that it means something that you have never realized that it means, and that you are an African, and that it means also something that you were never really aware that it means. Africanness, Africanity, it's something that's in the eyes of the beholder. I don't think that, in my experience, but that's only my experience. I'm only speaking from my experience. People, whether they're born in Cameroon or in any other African country, you might even say in any other country, don't start with a lot of adjectives, identifiers, just because they're born in Cameroon, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Morocco, whatever, wherever. I think that is always the common experience that brings us together on that. And I think that you become very much aware that there's a commonness when you get out of the country where you're born. Cameroon, in my case, is in the gaze of the other. When you say, I'm from Cameroon, people in the US and elsewhere automatically assume that you have a lot in common with somebody from Congo Brazzaville, or the DRC. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what is your class, quote unquote. Nothing else matters when you say that you are from an African country. The assumption is that you are in Europe or in America, that you are an economic immigrant or migrant, and that you're there to work. That's the assumption. Might be true in more cases, might be true in more cases than not, but that's the assumption. So Africanness is that something that people use to believe that all Africans, and often all black people, are the same. That's Africanness is. Is there any other thing that it can mean? I like very much that saying of Achille Bembe, and that Jean-François Bayard uses, that we have no identity. I have no identity. I have identifiers. So when you're from an African countries, there are things that you identify with. That doesn't mean that they define you, but they are identifiers about colonization, about more likely than that, authoritarian regimes, about that. There's stuff like that that defines you. So there's, maybe a common past, and maybe that shapes your worldview, but it doesn't have to. So that's what comes to my mind when I think of Africanness. So another way to talk about Africanness, Africanity, is to ask the question, the following way. What do Africans have in common in 2025? My answer to the question would be the belief that wealth and force are everything. So Africans believe in force and wealth, that it means everything in 2025. Then you're gonna say, yeah, Africans are basically like most people, and their answer to that would be yes. And you may also say Africans are Trumpian, and I would say very much so. Most African believe in what Trump believes, that money, wealth, and force is everything. Even in 2025, that the rule of law doesn't mean much. You have to have money, you have to have power, and then you can do whatever you want. That anything else is secondary. An example, I think that belief in power, that belief in raw power, in mentality, in manliness, in wealth, explains why most African are not really on Ukraine side. They believe that Zelensky is overdoing it, that he's basically milking the moment, and that Vladimir Putin is the good guy, the strong guy. He's the one that Africans more often than not admires, because yeah, he's strong, he's powerful, he's winning, and that's what Africans, when I say Africans, I'm overgeneralizing. I don't think that all Africans are the same. There will be a huge difference between those who are educated and those who are not, those who have some type of wealth. If you go to, let's call it that, but the African street, and say, what do you believe in? They're going to say to you, power, wealth. Who do you believe is the good guy? Who do you admire right now? They're going to say Putin and Trump. They're going to say, they're showing that everything else that the Westerners were saying about democracy, universal values, all those type of aid was bullshit. That it's all about power, wealth, and nothing else really, really matters. So yeah, in that sense, Africans most often than not believe in real politics, that what really you have to do is to accumulate wealth and power. So when you're an African outside of Africa, your experience is defined by your experience is defined by those things. I think I told this story already. The social worker from the Brussels Bar Association, the French part of it, told me, yeah, with Africans, the only thing that works is authority, force. With Africans, the only thing that works is force. You have to, beat some sense into them. Force. That's the only thing you have to use to make an African understand what you're trying to say, because we're not really civilized individuals. We can't talk to us slowly. We don't understand diplomacy. In Africa, everything goes wealth and power make right. That's why I think that also Africanness, this thing that is hard to define, that is defined most often than not by the gaze of the other, explains why victimhood in Africa is very, very problematic. I think that it's very difficult to be a victim in an African country than almost in any other country in the world. It's very, very difficult because injustice is normalized. Crime is normalized. Savagery is normalized. People have integrated the belief that black is bad, that Africa is the heart of the darkness, and that people have given up on the notion that injustice is unjust and shouldn't happen. People more often than not are going to tell you to take it, to accept it, especially if you have money. That's why, Miente, for me, it has been extremely hard, to put it mildly, to tell my story, to get anybody who usually cares, who usually professes to care about justice, to even care about what has happened, not only to my dad, Victor Fotso Victor, but to me. I keep telling this story. I will keep telling until I'm heard. This guy in Belgium, who's very famous, I'm not going to tell his name, tells me, so what? There are injustices in the world all the time. Why are you bugging me with this story? I feel bad, but there's nothing I can do. That is what people say when they hear African stories, to basically convince themselves that there's nothing that they can do. They're going to tell you that they feel bad. They're going to give you the usual sympathy, thinking that that's what you're asking for. But then they're going to stop there and say, there's nothing I can do. It's Africa. You are African. This shit happens all the time. This is the type of shit that happens every day. Why should we care? And that's, Miente, the why of this podcast. I am fighting desperately against that thing where people, when you are born in Africa, when you have African blood, when you are originally from Africa, that belief that you should just take it. Your people have been taking it for years. Your continent is poor. Savages is happening everywhere. So why should we care when something bad happens to you? You're out of Africa. You should feel lucky. You're here. You are within the Western civilization. You are living in a Western country. Be grateful. As K. Dot would say, shut up and be humble. So what? Your dad got raped, got abused, and got taken advantage of. So what? He's an African legend. So what? You're still the daughter of a rich person. You're still the daughter of a wealthy man. You're privileged. You're African, you're privileged. So shut up. In a way, why should people care? You're disabled, you're African, but you lived in America, you've lived in Belgium, you lived in Spain, you lived almost everywhere in the world. So why should we care that something bad has happened to you when people who look like you are going through worse? Shut up. The story doesn't matter. And Niente, I'm doing this podcast in English and in French. In French, it's getting easier. In English, it's still very, very difficult. Because, again, I will keep on saying it until I'm heard. African lives matter. Fotso matters. My story matters. What I want is for you guys to know the facts, to be aware of them, and to be able to tell me if you believe that my story doesn't matter, to explain to me why, using something other than stereotypes, by saying, Christelle, dear, when your dad dies March 19, 2020, at the American Hospital of Paris, that French laws are not respected, that there are shit happening over the world with this wealth, that people are complicit because they think that it's African. It's too complicated. This African, was stupid enough not to become French. He had many wives. So people are going to look at it and say, he made the mistake of thinking that he should continue the way his ancestors lived before. He had many wives, so what happened to him, he deserved it. Yeah, he deserved what happened to him. He was too messy, didn't get the world. He should have just become more Western. Yente, when I listened to those type of assertions or racist, even when they're made by African and Black people, it makes me want to try even harder to tell my story. And to have people talk back to me with more knowledge, to be specific, to understand that no, we're not the same. Africanness doesn't mean that we are born into this world to just serve other people, to be subjects in their stories, and that we're going to have to worship other people as heroes without being able to worship our own heroes. Whatever one thinks of Victor Fotso, of Fotso Victor, his story is amazing. If he were an American, he would be worshipped. He was able to become one of the wealthiest men on the continent without being able to read and to write. Just that fact says a lot about Africa, about its traditional societies, and tells you that they are so much there to get to know, to value, to cherish, and that all is needed is the will, the dedication to make it visible. And that's the goal of the podcast. So what is Africanness? I think that Africans are very Trumpian. They love Trump. They love Putin, Vladimir Putin. Because wealth, force, and that manliness, that just confirms what they have learned about the world, at least in the last 100 years. That in Africa, might means right. I disagree. The history of Africa is more complex, and that, as Jean-François Bayard again shows, Africans are not just victims. They have always participated in the exploitation of their own continent. And I'm doing this podcast so justice, victimhood, they have to stop. And we have to write our own stories and to tell them, to be able to say, even on the African continent, whether it is about a wealthy man like Fotso Victor, whether it's about me, Niante, no justice, no peace. It isn't just for me, for my dad. African lives matter because Africanness doesn't mean, no matter how you define it, whether it exists or not, that we are defined by stereotype. But it wasn't always about being victims. Sometimes more than other were actors. What is needed is for you guys to just get to know more, not only about my story, but about African stories. And that's the point of the podcast. Africanness. Let's make it individual specific. And it doesn't have to be all encompassing. If it exists, it can mean different things to all Africans. And yes, it doesn't have to justify stupidity, ignorance, and intolerance. whether you're Trumpian and whether or not you use Pan-Africanism to think that you can avoid knowing the facts about each African country and about each African person. African life matter, and we are individuals with stories that matter and that are different. Let me know, me and Dave, whether or not you like the podcast. You can write to me, of course, and don't forget to follow the channel.